Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 76th Annual General Meeting of Forest Professionals, British Columbia, the new name for the Association of BC Forest Professionals. I'm Jamie Jeffries, Chair of the FPBC Board, and I'll be the MC for today's AGM. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the business and work of FPBC registrants occurs on lands that Indigenous people have lived on and cared for since time immemorial. Those of us in this room today are meeting on the land that is home to the West Bank First Nation, one of 8 Okanagan Nation communities of the Silk people. This AGM is being live streamed as part of our hybrid conference model, and I want to welcome all registrants who are also watching online, and thank you for participating. Thank you to Matt Scott and all the members of the Kelowna Conference Program Panel and FPBC staff who have been responsible for planning this event for us. I also want to thank those who have supported this conference by exhibiting in our trade show and sponsoring various functions and sessions. This year's AGM is the third under our Professional Governance Act, which came into effect 3 years ago on February 5th, 2021. As a result of that, the format for the AGMs have changed. Registrants are no longer required to move approval of last year's minutes, the audited financial statements, appointment of auditors, or approval of the annual report. As in previous years, quorum for the AGM is 40 registrants, and from scanning the room, I'd say we have quorum. There'll be 2 opportunities to ask questions after the CEO and Finance Director's reports on past year's business activities and the audited financial statements, and following the reports on discipline and practice. We'll begin with Christine Gelowitz, FPBC CEO, and Aga Gendo, FPBC Finance Director. You can ask questions after Christine and Aga's reports by typing them in the Q&A box on the Event Mobi conference platform or in the Event Mobi app on your phone. Now I'd like to turn the podium over to Christine Gelowitz, FPBC CEO, for her report on the 2023 business accomplishments.
Good afternoon. Trying to adjust to having glasses, and I don't know how I'll make out without them, so there they are. So, good afternoon. I just want to, Jamie mentioned we're going to use the app to ask questions, and similar to Mike Simpson's comments this morning, as the moderator for those questions, help me by keeping short, concise questions, and it'll be a lot easier for us to move through those questions faster. We'll do our best to get through as many as we can. I also wanted to note that this entire conference is a professional development event, and that includes the annual general meeting. There should be learning that you're taking away from here, and learning about how our profession is regulated, and learning about takeaways for yourself as a regulated professional. So today we're going to talk about the state of the profession. Oh, I should have advanced my slide. We're going to talk about the state of the profession. We'll talk a little bit about how we're doing in some of our core regulatory programs and some of the performance there. And we'll take a look at how is our financial health? How is the organization doing to sustain itself into the future? We'll take a pause there for some questions, and then I'm going to invite Casey and Garnet up, our Registrar and Director of Practice, to then focus a little bit more on things for you as an individual forest professional, some learnings you can take away from what we've seen from regulating the practice. So I'm going to start with just some of the facts for you to help you get some context. And having an understanding about the makeup of the profession as it stands today, how it's been changing over the past number of years, is going to help us figure out what we might need to do differently as we start moving forward. It also helps us determine and figure out the programs and services that we as a regulatory body must provide, how we might need to adjust those in response to the way our demographics are changing. So it's important we take a look at the data and get an understanding. At 5,184 total registrants, we're holding pretty steady. if you look back in time, we first broke 5,000 as a profession back in 2000, I better double check, 2005. And when we went over 5,000, that was when we had RFTs join the ranks alongside of RPFs. For 20 years, ever since then, we've hovered between 5,100 and 5,600. There's always a little bit of variation in there, but that's kind of about where we've been staying. So as you can see, things are fairly steady state, but there are some trends inside of that number that we should be paying attention to. So this slide's got a lot going on, and I'll let you kind of take it in. But as you look at it, what I want to share with you is just some of the key messages, some of the takeaways from here. In the last decade, I think it's really important for us to pay attention to the number of practicing RPFs and RFTs has been in a pretty steady decline. It's declined by about 850 RPFs and RFTs. The good news is that despite I heard some people say something different, there are a lot of young people going into forestry. And you can see that here. You can see that there's nearly 300 more trainees in our system today than there was 10 years ago. That's good news, but I know you're doing the math. 850, 300 more. We've got a shortfall there of about 550. So the decline in practicing RPFs and RFTs, I think that's probably going to continue, and we're going to see that trend continue for a few more years, just based on the age demographics, which we'll look at next. And because of that, it means we have to start doing a few things differently. And I'll also share some thoughts about that in just another slide or two. But for now, I just want to kind of stay on the facts of what we're seeing here. The last kind of big takeaway to look at here is the red line. And you can see what the red line is our number of retired registrants in the profession. Last year, it did hit its peak at 911. That was about 3 times as many retired registrants in the profession as there was 20 years ago. So that looks quite a lot different. This year, we started to see it started to come back down, and I think that will continue a bit as we go forward. So just taking a little bit of a closer look now at some of the demographics, you can see there's some pretty positive shifts happening in the profession. The gender balance is improving. So we're approaching a quarter female, and the farthest I can look back and find data is 2011 around demographics. And when I looked back to 2011, the percentage of females in the profession was at 16%. We've got a ways to go before we're seeing some more balance, but that's a pretty good, steady increase that I think is a positive shift. You can also see that the number of registrants who self-identify as First Nations, Inuit, or Métis is also increasing from 156 back in 2011 to about 239 in 2023. So hopefully we'll see that number continue to rise, and as we develop new pathways for more people to enter the forest profession for the years to come ahead. I also want to talk a little bit just about our age demographics in the profession and point out a few of the key shifts that we're seeing. So back in 2011, that age category of age 20 to 30, there was 3% in that category. You can see now it's up a little bit over 14%. So a lot more younger people in the profession. On the other side, what we see is age 41 to 50, that one has shrunk down in terms of percentage. So people in that age category, it used to be 30%, a little more than a decade ago. So what this means is the average years of experience of forest professionals is going down a bit. What does that mean? What should you be thinking about there? It means the profession, it means employers. We have to pay attention to how we continue to maintain deep competence in some of our practice areas. The kind of competence that comes from practical experience, from years of working and doing that type of work. So one of the ways the profession is now thinking about that, and part of the solution to that, is starting to foster more communities of practice in professional forestry. And there's already existing communities. It's about growing, leveraging those, and identifying new ones. So the next slide here, I don't want to leave without taking a look at what is coming into the profession, the growth inside the profession. Last year, we inducted 161 new forest professionals into the profession. That's the most that we've had in a single year since 2008. I'm also very thankful that about 90 of them have joined our conference in person this year, and so I think there's quite a few new faces in the crowd for us all to meet and welcome. The orange line or yellow kind of line at the top, I'm looking at that screen, it does not look yellow. Oh, it looks yellow up there. That's showing you the total number of active trainees who are working through their professional registration process right now. It peaked in 2019. It peaked at about 750, and so now, 4 years later, in 2023, it's about 100 less. The red line is new applicants who have just enrolled to start their process as a trainee. And you can see that there's been a pretty solid, steady stream for quite a while, but there is some slight tapering off happening. The last thing I wanted to share about thinking about new entrants and new trainees is that we are seeing that it's taking trainees longer to complete their registration period, the average number of months it takes to complete. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but part of it is also what we do as the regulator. And so we are looking to see what role we play and how we can support bringing down the timeliness of that process so it can move faster. And so that means the staff, we're looking at how we can streamline the modules, reduce the volume of material and minimize the number of exams, as well as the quality of those learning materials. Last year, we also did a survey to gather feedback from the CAP experience from trainees or recent inductees, and we're going to start implementing those changes this year. Oh, there we go. So just before I wrap up on this section about the state of the profession and how we're doing, I want to talk about what we're cast our eyes forward a little bit and what we're doing and thinking as we expect change for the future. It's important that we start thinking about creating new and different pathways that allow others, people who have skills, knowledge, experience in forest management, to find a place within the forest profession. That looks like using associate pathways, things like an affiliated forest professional, forest technicians, and limited licenses. These things I'm talking about aren't just plans we have. We are already starting to do this. In December of this year, we began accepting applications for the AFP designation, which is targeting a new way for academics and researchers, those people who have really deep knowledge and expertise, to find a way into the profession that aligns with their needs. Without a doubt, RPFs and RFTs are going to continue to be a foundation for the profession, but that area too is evolving. We allow a lot more diversity in the type of education that qualifies someone to meet the education standards to enter and become an RPF or RFT across Canada, and the areas of practice that people are working in are changing. We heard this morning from our panels how much forest management is changing, how much it needs to change going forward. That means we need more diversity in the skill sets to find our way through that work forward. There's room for new and different forest practitioners in the professional forestry community, and we're trying to design the pathways for that. But I want to also point out, I get that professional regulation is expensive. It costs money to do this. And so we only want to apply those professional regulatory tools that we have where we need greater assurance for the public so they can have confidence about what's happening out in the forest, or where we need to raise the bar to just that little bit more to better protect the environment, or the safety and interests of the public. So some of the areas, for example, where we're also having conversations is about what does it look like to use professional regulation a little bit more in practice areas like wildfire. So now shifting gears, I want to just talk a bit about some of our core regulatory work. So since the PGA came into force, we've saw quite a higher number of complaints. And I don't think that's a reflection that there's something wrong. That's actually just, I think, about greater awareness by you as registrants about your duty to report, and you are making those reports. And it's also about greater public awareness of the work of the regulatory body that was caused by the PGA and how much conversation there is about that more broadly. Of course, this kind of shift in magnitude has put quite a strain on the resources of the regulatory body to support that, both the staff capacity to manage through that process in a timely way, the legal costs that come with that. So last year, we did hire a new deputy director in the compliance team to support this workload, and we've also been broadening our contractor pool of investigators. So this is, sometimes people say, what happened with that fee increase? It's this part of our regulatory business. This is where some of those funds have been directed to. Another thing that we've been hearing from registrants is that there's a lot more concern more recent years about unlawful practice. That's people who are not registrants of the profession doing the work of professional forestry. So we've been trying to build the capacity to be able to respond to those complaints that are being filed and to hear those concerns. And you need a bit of structure around that. So we have a three-point approach to that, which is thinking about what do we need to do to educate and raise awareness, monitoring and enforcement. Education and awareness is more about working with employers to make them aware. There's some people who just don't know what the work of our profession is, where they should be used. In this current year, we're really focusing on municipalities, that level of government. To the monitoring side, that looks like for us, we're assessing job advertisements so that we see when people are describing what is the professional work of forestry and they're not looking for a forest professional, we're reaching out to those hiring people saying, what is it that this role is going to do? Because it looks a lot like forestry. And we're following up with people like that. It looks like monitoring can also look like we did a large preliminary audit of the ministry, and now we're working with the ministry to validate those results, and we're beginning to talk about how we can develop some flexible solutions together where there might be some things that are slightly misaligned. On the enforcement front, what does that look like? We receive complaints that are quite specific sometimes, but sometimes less specific. So that means following up and making those calls, making those inquiries. And it also can mean doing things like when we receive requests from people to retire, resign. It means that we review and confirm based on the information that they've provided to us that they're not going to be continuing to do work that's professional forestry. So this entire bucket of work is something that we really didn't have the capacity to do prior to this, and we've really appreciated your patience while we try to grow out our capacity and do the work here under the PGA. Professional standards. What makes or differentiates you, what really sets you apart as a professional is that you follow standards. Standards in how you conduct yourself, standards for being competent to do certain type of work, and standards for different areas of professional practice. The other thing that sets you apart as a registered and regulated professional is you've agreed for a regulatory body to monitor how well you're doing in meeting those standards and living up to that. So just a little quick piece on that. When it comes to some of the professional competence regulatory work we do We saw really strong performance again this year. It was our second year that I don't need to tell you, you were doing that reporting, and you again had such incredible performance. Well over 90% fully met that requirement by November 30th. There are some of you who were short a few hours and have a little work to do. And there's some who've got a little more to do, but that's the type of work that staff will do and follow up with those individuals. But I think for a new requirement, coming out of the gate last year, it's actually quite a lot closer to 95%. I think that speaks to the integrity and the responsibility that you all show up and deliver all the time. That information you've been providing to us, I also just want to make a comment about the fact that you've been filling out, where do you think you want to do future learning? What did you learn? That's what this is all about. It's not about counting hours, it's about maintaining your competence. And so asking yourself that question, what did I learn today? What do I still need to learn? We also mine that data, just so you know, to look for information to help us figure out if we're developing professional development products, what would be the most use to you and where do you see some gaps. And just a quick look this year, I think it's pretty impressive to see that last year 11,000 hours of CPD were logged on Indigenous learning that was reported by you all. And I think that's a pretty strong testament to our commitment to Indigenous reconciliation as a profession. So I'm just going to quickly wrap up now with a few images and comments from the public awareness work we do. The work that forest professionals do, we understand it, most people don't. And it's because we're sometimes one step removed from the direct public in the work and the role that we play in forest management. So part of how we try to get the message out is through online campaigns. And this is just a few of the images from this year's online campaign. Another way that we try to get some messaging out and to profile the work that you do as professionals and the work that we do as a regulated profession is through opinion columns. And so in this last year, we had 3 columns that ran in major newspapers like the Vancouver Sun, the Province, and Times Colonist. And these, again, focused on helping people understand the role that a forest professional plays in forest management and their place within this bigger system for how forests are managed, but also to talk about wildfire and the focused response that needs to happen in a really timely way. So there's so much more I could share. You can find more of it in the annual report, but I'm going to stop there and now invite Aga, our Director of Finance and Administration, to join the podium to share a bit more about our financial health.
Thank you, Christine, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Agaya Jindo, and I'm the Director of Finance. So I'm here to present an overview of 2023 financial results. The results are now posted on the website. They were audited by D&H Group. They were reviewed by the Finance Subcommittee as well as the Board of Directors. My first slide summarizes revenues, expenses, budgets, and actuals. As you can see, we ended the year with $3.95 million in revenues, and that was close to $400,000 higher than what we budgeted. There are 3 sort of major groups in our revenue sources. One of them is the annual registration fees. Christine has provided some trends with the number of registrants renewing every year. And in 2023, we saw that we ended up having $26,000 less in our annual fees than we anticipated. We also have application and exam fees. This is a smaller component in our overall revenues, and we were pretty much on budget. And you can see the third one, which is other income. This is where we are we were higher by close to $420,000 compared to the budget. There were a number of items that contributed to those results. So last year's conference was sold out, and with lower cost of organizing the conference in Prince George, we ended up having a net profit of $219,000. Our advertising revenues continued strong and ended up on budget. Our grant income, so we do some projects that are grant funded, so we also had some grant income in our results. And we had higher interest rates. We all saw higher interest rates on the market, and the cash that we had in our bank account generated close to $100,000 in revenues. When we switch over to expenses, so it costed us $3.82 million to run operations, and we were above the budget. So we were $266,000 above the budget. Our program expenses were higher, and that happened for a number of reasons. Christine has already mentioned trends in complaints over the past few years, and this translated into higher program costs in complaints. So we exceeded the budget by $113,000. We subsequently transferred money from our reserve fund to our operating fund, and I'll discuss that in more details later. This also includes grant-funded work. I've already talked about it on the revenue side. It also works on the expense side. And expenses related to implementation of the registration management system. So in 2023, we started the work to implement and transition to a new registration management system. Initially, the cost of this project was all included in our capital budget, so the only component that would translate into our operating budget would be the amortization cost. Accounting standards have changed, and we were able to allocate some costs as they were relevant to our operating budget, and we're able to allocate some costs to our capital budget. So that's why part of the program expenses increase over the budget is due to the implementation. Our office expenses costs were somewhat lower, and that again has to do with the amortization change. So normally if we were to implement the system, amortization costs would show up as part of the office expenses. With the change in accounting standards, that did not happen in 2023. And our staffing expenses were pretty much close to the budget. We were 2% below, and that was mostly due to a delay in hiring for some of the vacant positions that we had. So the FPBC ended up with $126,000 in operating surplus compared to where we started with a balanced budget. So I've already mentioned about sort of three major revenue groups for FPBC, and the slide shows you that in 2023, 81% of our revenues came from annual registration fees, and a significant component, the 14%, came from interest, conference revenues, advertising, so a number of other sources. My other slide looks at the expense side. So as you can see, 59% of our costs go into staff-related costs. These are not only salaries and benefits, these are also costs related to travel, recruitment, filling in for temporary vacancies sometimes, and also professional development for staff. Christine also talked about compliance-related expenses. She talked about registration practice groups. This particular slide shows all of our expenses as they're allocated to various groups. So we have 8 programs or businesses, and for this year, what's also different is we've allocated or we've separated database and LMS-related costs. So LMS is our learning management system, and database is our regulatory management system. So this is the system we use to renew registrations. So 15% of our costs were allocated to registration and compliance departments each. And registration supports new enrollment, supports changes to registration, so any application for leave of absence, reinstatement, or retirement. And our compliance cost includes cost of investigation, and Christine provided more details in her presentation on those costs. 22% of our costs were allocated to registrant and external engagement, and that includes all of our communication activities, outreach to schools, career fairs, as well as various stakeholders groups. And 11% of our budget was allocated to our registrant management system and learning management system costs. So these are the costs, these are higher costs that we see in 2023. We expect them to remain high in 2024, and we expect them to start decreasing after that. We started the transition in 2023 to a new system, and the work will continue in 2024. And 10% of our cost was allocated to professional practice, so practice guidance, practice advisory services, and competency and conduct audits. 8% allocated to continuing competence, so cost of creating and developing content such as e-courses and webinars. 10% business management, and that includes the cost of running the office, so rent, internet. It also includes the conducting the annual audit, IT, services, business office, software licenses. And the smaller component, 9% allocated to support board-related activities, legal costs, PGA costs. So earlier I mentioned a transfer of funds between our reserve fund and operating fund. So FPBC operates with two funds. All of our operating budget revenues and expenses go through our operating fund. And the assets of this operating fund, when you look at them on November 30th, this is when the assets are the highest, because this is when we collected the registration fees. So our current assets are at the highest level at that time. It also includes investments in property, and we have small amounts invested in those. These are mostly office-related equipment. What is new this year is the category called intangible assets. The work that we did on our regulatory management system is now considered intangible assets, so the value of that work is included in that number, as well as the new website that we introduced in 2023. On the flip side of our total assets are the liabilities. So again, on November 30th, we carry a high number of liabilities. These are really the registration dues that we collect, and yet they are unearned as of November 30th. So we have to recognize them as liabilities. What is included under the operating fund column under assets is the $113,000 that we had to transfer from reserves. What about the reserve fund? So over the years, FPBC has built up a reserve fund, and that is to protect us from major expenses that cannot be funded through annual operating fund. So some examples would be the $113,000 that was transferred in discipline expenses. The amount was determined because the expenses were higher than what we budgeted, and as part of one of the policies that we have, that was a transfer that had to be done. And then it also includes other special initiatives that would be authorized by the board. So at the end of 2023, our reserve fund at $1.6 million was lower than what we had last year. We've earned $60,000 in cash during the year, and we had to transfer $113,000 out. And this particular fund has no liabilities. So I also wanted to share 2024 budget with comparing it to our 2023 actuals. So we anticipate increases in program expenses as well as higher staffing expenses. So we anticipate expenses to go up by 6%. And to partially cover higher expenses, registration fees were raised by 5%. The budget is based on the expectation that there will be a decrease in other income. So as you can see, in 2023, we've generated $568,000 in other income. We budget $304,000 for 2024. Part of that is that the conference, we anticipate that this conference will generate less in revenues with higher costs of running it in Kelowna. We're hoping to generate as much in interest income, if not more, than we did in 2023. And so as you can see, overall, we anticipate a deficit budget. It's a significant deficit of 7,000. And part of that is the work that we're doing on the regulatory management system. So that's the work that will continue to 2024. I also wanted to show historical results. So going back to 2012, over 11 years, the association generated surpluses. There were 2 years that had fairly small deficits, and for 2024, we project a fairly significant deficit. So the deficit was sort of proposed and approved because of the work that we do with the implementation of the software. We also, at the time of preparing the budget and at the time of setting up the fees, we anticipated having a surplus, and that also would allow us the opportunity to use up the surpluses that were accumulated over the years. And this concludes my presentation. So thank you for your time. And please remember that the full version of our audited financial statements with all of the notes are available on our website. Thank you.
So I can see quite a number of questions have come into the Q&A, so we'll go through, Dean, still 15 minutes or 13 minutes. Dean runs a tight ship. So we'll go through as much as we can, and then we will ask Garnet and Casey to come to the stage, and then we'll have a few more minutes for questions. So Dean, the screen here looks a little different than in my app, so I just want to make sure I'm looking at the right thing. Okay, well, I figured that out with Dean. The first question I see is, how can we leverage the knowledge that retired members have when they aren't allowed to practice? So I'm going to invite Casey to help me with that first response, because it really gets down to what are the rights and authorities of retired category registrants.
Head on. I think if I understand the question correctly, it's about the value of the knowledge of retired registrants. So obviously we've made some changes with how we regulate with respect to non-practicing, and retired is non-practicing. So there's a hard line there, and that's been an adjustment for people. There's a culture within the profession that retired registrants continue to give back, but there's a strong propensity that in that process they also end up giving advice, and that's and at the same time not having to maintain their competency. So that is a risk area in regulating. Now that has a very impersonal feel to it, and I've personally received a lot of pushback on that. What I want to recognize though is the ability for retired registrants to still participate in different ways is still there. Now, first of all, the thing to ask yourself is, am I really retiring? Like really? Because some people are like, it's like a soft retirement, right? So if you're truly ending your practice, then retire, resign. Like the options are there. The public, other professions, you don't go to a doctor who's retired and go, can you remove my appendix, right? So starting to compare ourselves to the way that other professions regulate themselves is part of the normalized structure under the PGA and just regulating in a society. So, I think it's good to have those comparisons. But for instance, Garnet's going to talk about communities of practice. These are things that we want to be very inclusive, non-registrants, registrants, and that's all part of knowledge contribution. So I think there's more ways we can explore this, but that's what I'd say right now.
Thanks, Casey. And that's a great segue to the next question in the app here, which is, the reduction in experience is a real issue. What is FPBC doing to reestablish programs to facilitate professional development and mentorship, such as past programs like LORAX, SIBC, and the Pupil Program? So I'll ask Garnet to talk about this because we are looking at bringing back some of those professional development materials, but also growing communities of practice. So maybe Garnet can unpack in just 1 minute.
Yeah, I'll have more when I take the mic officially. I think it's a really good question, and again, we look at what is happening in our ecosystem as far as extension, and there's been a real deficit of extension services in the profession for probably 2 decades. I remember when I entered in the 90s, there was all kinds of FERDA publications and SIBC. I didn't see the question, but what you referenced in the question, I mean, those all ringing to me. And what we're excited about is that institutes are reaching out to us. They're asking us to be on their advisory panels and help inform what that next generation of extension looks like to support forest professionals as they graduate. Yeah, and Casey's
Can
going
I add something?
Sure.
With respect to what Garnet just said, you know, if you look at the history of professional development and extension services, the 90s was a very rich time under the Forest Practices Code, and a lot of us have this baseline of knowledge, and we look to the different generations coming up and going, the same opportunity for that training isn't there. And the gap is being filled by employers themselves doing things for their staff. And there's a little bit more than that going on. But what I want to put in a plug here is that as we develop professional standards, it's going to create a marketplace for professional development. And that's because there's going to be alignment between whoever's developing that curriculum with the standard, with the demand for the person who's certified at the end. So think of it as a chain. And the chain wasn't sustainable in the past because it didn't have the linkage to the certification and the durability of the training programs.
Okay, the next question I have is, what are the changes are we planning to implement as a result of the trainee survey? So there's some really quick things that we might be able to do and some things that are going to take a bit longer over time. You know, some of the early things that you'll see adopted right away this year is rolling out of challenge exams. So that allows people, when they do credential assessment, if something resulted where they didn't have, it wasn't found that they met that requirement, they can write a challenge exam to achieve that in a much faster way. We're also looking at, is there too much content in the learning management system that people go through? Can we eliminate some of that content or move it after registration has occurred? There's quite a lot more that Casey could unpack in a lot of detail, but in the interest of trying to get to more questions, I'll say maybe that's a question that you can follow up with Casey offline for more detail, and I'll keep moving. The next question here is, do you have numbers on how many trainees quit the process? And I'll ask Casey to talk to that briefly.
It changes every year, but you can see in the numbers that we were down about 100 and, how many was it, 113 or something?
Yeah, but a little over 100 over the last 4.
Yeah, so I mean, we do see the attrition in the training rates, and we've been asking a lot of questions about that internally. It's troubling in one way. On the other hand, that naturally fluctuates with the demand in the workforce. And we're less tied to the traditional ups and downs of the manufacturing sector. We're more resilient than we were as a profession and as a workforce because of the diversity of employment. But it's still there. And so when we see a retraction in lumber prices, you know other things are going to follow, right? So there's some of that. We know there's other reasons. We've done other surveys for this. You can come and talk to me if you want to explore other things that we've heard. But don't think that we're not monitoring and we're not listening. We just don't always have the opportunity to dialogue with you all about this. So I encourage you to call us and we can have those chats if there's something you're deeply concerned about.
Thanks, Casey. The next question I'm looking at up here, it says the association, or otherwise now known as the regulatory body, claims that there's a lot of the fee increases due to investigation into complaints. How many investigations led to more than just how many led to discipline actions? How many investigations led to monetary fines? And if there were any, how much did the fines total? So the annual report has a little bit more detail on this. You can, I don't have the slide to put back up from, that I showed earlier. In the last year, we had about 24 complaints, 15 of those advanced into further inquiry or investigation, and a smaller number led to discipline. There's also a number of active complaints going back still to 2020 that are still in progress. That process of investigation can be quite extensive and lengthy, and it also requires negotiation, sometimes with lawyers back and forth. So there's a number of investigations, not just that started this year, that have been in play and continue in play for the last 3 years. With respect to how many have led to fines, I can't recall that data off the top of my head, but I'll ask our registrar if he can. I know the annual report does report on the number that went to fines, but in terms of the monetary value of fines, I don't have that number offhand.
Yeah, so the annual report does have the numbers. It lists the type of penalties that were levied in a total, not case by case, but you can also go and look at the digests on site, on our website, and see what the remedies were associated with each case. We did issue the biggest fine we've ever issued. The Foresters Act used to limit us to a $10,000 fine. The PGA is a $100,000 fine. Now, that doesn't mean we're just going to issue $100,000 fines, but we did issue a $20,000 fine in the past year, as well as the year before a couple of $7,000 fines. And there's a logic behind how that works in administrative law, proportionality, administrative fairness, you know, what was the intention behind the breach, that sort of thing. So yeah, the fines are increasing, and the general liabilities associated with this are increasing, but don't steal all my thunder from my talk.
Okay, let's have one for Aga here. Please comment and explain from the financial statement, Schedule A, page 8, shows that registration data management, discipline, and professional practice were far over budget. Discipline costs were covered by reserve funds as per note 8, while professional Pro D and practice guidance were well under.
Okay, thank you. So the database cost that this question is referring to, this has to do with the implementation of the system. And as we said, that was new for us. We pulled it out of registration costs. Normally, we would have that as part of the overall registration cost. We pulled that as a separate category to show the budget versus the cost. The big change is the fact that we initially thought that we're going to amortize those costs. So they would have showed up differently, and we've just, with the change in accounting standards, and because of the nature of the software itself, that changed our presentation. So this is one part of the question, and I think the other part is talking about the discipline. So I think, as Christine mentioned in her presentation, because of the high number of discipline cases, our discipline costs were higher, $113,000 compared to what we budgeted. The association has a policy that says that we budget based on 5-year average, so our budget would change every year, and then depending whether our costs end up being over or under, we have to move the funds between the two funds that I presented, the operating and reserve fund. So with the higher workload for that department, we had higher costs. And I think the last part of the question is talking about the professional practice being far over the budget. So with the changes in our priorities, we basically ended up doing more work that was related to practice guidance, and that is part of Garnett's portfolio that he'll talk more about in his presentation. Thank you.
I can also just add a little bit to that too. With the Professional Governance Act, you know, and professional practice, other things that fit in there now is a brand new statutory committee, the Audit and Practice Review Committee. Running committees, while we engage volunteers, public members, are expensive to operate. That's a new cost and a new workload responsibility that that includes some of the operating dollars. I'd also just comment generally, we talk about the RMS, the Registration Management System. That represents, when it's done, a $750,000 IT project. We're trying to manage that in a nonprofit small budget. So that's really hitting our books pretty hard. We need that system, though. That system also helps us respond to what we saw with changes with the Professional Governance Act. The Professional Governance Act, the act itself is over 100 pages. It has 8 regulations below it, and it has 13 policy directives from the superintendent, versus our Foresters Act was about 30 pages. That's a lot more rigor in some of the regulatory requirements we're responsible to deliver. We need an IT solution for some of that to carry that workload. And all of you also know how important it is to have data to manage and work with things. Our system we have right now is 15 years old. It's held together by bubble gum and duct tape. It needs to be stable. And not investing in our IT is now becoming a liability for being able to meet our obligations and responsibilities. But also, it's a tool to be better. It can hold all of our data from our complaint systems, from our audits, from the CPD, but also it can start sending communications, put performance metrics in place. It can drive improved performance for us. That IT investment is huge in a small budget like ours, but critical for helping us position for the future. So Dean is giving me the wrap it up and get Casey and Garnet up here. So I'll just wrap with one last thing. I saw in the Q&A somewhere, what happened to all the questions from last year? I don't see where that was followed up. We did actually host a webinar a month after to go through those questions that we didn't get to in the event. And we also had an article in our magazine. So that information is there. And if there's a need to do something like that this year, I'll commit that we'll look at that as well. So with that, let's invite our registrar second, then first our director of practice, Garnet Muro.
Thank you, Christine. Wyatt, welcome. I want you to reflect on the community that you grew up in. And for those online, you can play along too, but here in the room, we're going to raise our hands. So how many of you grew up in a community of less than 5 million people? Yeah. I thought that'd be a safe question to get everyone's hands up. It's almost like asking, were you warm enough in the icebreaker room last night? How many of you grew up in a town of 50,000 or less? Still quite a few. All right, one last time. 5,000 or less. No, not bad. When I reflect on that question for myself, the answer is 200. And I'm not talking about 200,000, I'm talking about 200. That community was one where we knew our neighbors, and when we wanted to do something, we got together. We had raffles, we had bake sales, we went to bingos to raise money, and when it was time to put up the new rink, gosh, we put in artificial ice, and everybody in the community got together and we built it together. Did we all agree all the time? No, not even close. But everything is connected. And if I was to draw a circle around the forest professionals of British Columbia as a community, we're 5,000. Heck, when we look in this room, we've got 500. That's 10%. Online's another 1,500. That's 30. We're at 40% engagement of our registrant body, our population, in hearing the messages this week. That's something to be proud of. Well done, and thank you for showing up. It's those who show up that make the difference. How we adapt as a profession going forward matters. What we decide to do as a community matters. It's important. When I think of the initiatives that our team is going to do, and I think of my colleagues on stage with me today, my practice team, Troy and Tara, soon joining us, And back in the office in Vancouver, all that support staff and the registration team, there's key initiatives that we're tackling collaboratively, internally, so that we can make a difference. One of those Christine's already touched on is the community of practice concept. We're doing outreach to communities of practice right now. In some cases, we'll have to create a community of practice. In others, we're looking to amplify and profile them, promote them. Communities of practice in silviculture, NSC, Cisco. Communities of forest practice in timber cruising. Communities of forest practice in wildland fire or urban forestry. These are all top of mind, all with really strong ties to public interest. And who does the heavy lifting? Well, it's mechanisms like joint working groups that support these communities of practice. A community of practice is intended to be inclusive in dialogue, where we can learn from each other. Here in the Silks community, we heard Chief Robert Louis express how the connectedness to the land is so important. This morning, we heard from Marina on the Hawaiian initiatives and how much pride I had listening to Marina. When I was elected onto council, Marina joined me on that same year. At that time, she was pregnant, having a baby. Once again, so inspiring. We have to have broader thinking. We've heard that this morning with folks that went to Finland, the panels on forest landscape planning, concepts like fire is a medicine to the land. How do we think differently? We, as a group of 5,000 practitioners, we need outside voices to help inform our own decision-making. We need to build relationships. We need to be innovative and create change. And from those communities of practice, we want to take what we hear, and from a regulator's lens, what does that mean? This is about establishing standards. Where are the curbs? These standards, this is the clear vision that we have. It's like, for those fans of The Wizard of Oz, when Dorothy's walking down that path and she runs into Scarecrow, and Scarecrow says to Dorothy, well, where are you going? And she goes, well, I don't know. And then Scarecrow goes, well, then any path will take you there. We need direction, we need guidance. That's what these standards are going to be, is helping you as practitioners know where you're going. Where are the boundaries? Where are the ditches? You need to know that. And this leads directly into professional independence. How are we demonstrating our competence? I love what Christine mentioned earlier. It's not about filling in the numbers. It's a behavior. Be proud of the education and the learning and the training that you continue to do on an annual basis to expand your own personal professional body of learning. I want to see you link your learning to what you report in your CPD. I think it's critical. How do you maintain relevant in your area of practice? It's so key. My call to action to you as a group, and thank you again for being here, is to join a community of practice. Lend your voice to the conversation. Grow as a professional. Learn from others. Have a curious mind, open heart. Limlet, thank you.
Trying to figure out how to follow that up. It's like good cop, bad cop routine. So I'm here to talk about discipline complaints. You can see from Christine's slides the data side of it, and okay, yeah, I'm up here. Let's just jump ahead, and it probably needs to point here. Yeah. So some general observations. You've seen the threefold increase in complaints under the PGA. That has a real impact on our programming. It has an impact on the registrant base. The duty to report obligation was brought up. I think that's a significant contributor to this. And it's important that you all think about that as registrants, as an obligation as well. So the public has expectations that in some cases are not being met. And we need to digest that and think about it. Just some general observations. from the complaints program. We are seeing gaps in due diligence. This is almost in every investigation that we undertake, that there is some type of diligence that's lacking on behalf of the respondent. We've seen a trend of inadequate record keeping. So you've done the work, it's in your head, it's not necessarily documented or reproducible in the event of an investigation. And that's tricky because you can't really defend yourself either when you don't have the documentation to do that. Some deficiency in knowledge currency or competency, depending on how you want to look at that. In some cases, an erosion of the knowledge that someone maybe once possessed and is relying on old knowledge or to some degree bias. That's showing up as well. And trying to do too much, and I've got a little expansion paragraph on this, that it's a chronic issue with the breadth of the scope in our profession. So those of us who've been RPFs for a while, you've got this big thing that's called the practice of forestry, and that provides authorization to practice inside of that scope. But you may have heard us talking a lot about competency versus authorization. An RPF has the authority to practice in all these different places, but may not be competent. Conversely, a non-registrant, and we're seeing this increasingly in some of these community spaces that Garnet's talking about, we have people who are non-registrants that are actually very competent. They may be more competent than the registrant in that particular area of practice, but they don't have the authority under the regulation to undertake the practice. And I'm going to touch on briefly when I get into the unlawful practice slide, just where we're kind of going with that, and you've already heard hints about it. But this breadth of the profession is our friend and our enemy, and I guess this is just a bit of a road hazard for everybody to be thinking about, and aligning competencies to the areas that you practice in, and the fact that that's something we're now actively monitoring, and we have to monitor under the PGA. So some highlights from 2023 decisions. Not going to get into big detail, but you can go on the website and see these decisions. We do have quite a large number of investigations underway at all various stages, from intake to investigation to resolution. And there's a lot of work that me and my team are doing to reduce timelines, ensure fairness. So if you know anybody up here who's going through a discipline investigation and they're inevitably going to feel some heat and be frustrated, I want to commit to the registrant base that we are going to do better with using our resources to do better at this work. Stream misclassification was one case that led to discipline results, and in that case it was a reprimand. A lakeshore riparian area was impacted from private land development. This was the larger fine I mentioned earlier, the $20,000 fine. Suspension was in place for a period of time, ethics training, and a reprimand, as well as a cruising case on private land, where there was an issue kind of with the cruise design and with inadequate communication to the client or clients. Yeah, we put limitations on that one, a reprimand, and a requirement to undertake a record-keeping course. So I just want to say something generally about complaints. As a profession, we need to normalize that this is part of what we sign up for. It's part of public accountability. It is collective learning. It doesn't feel good when it's you, but we're all learning from each other's mistakes, and we all make mistakes. I can tell you that there's tension in the people involved in investigations. They're like, that could be me. I've made that mistake before. Like, this is real human stuff. The difference is that somebody may complain about it. And that's the thing that we hold ourselves accountable to, that when it happens. And I want to say this, the public cares about our practice. You might be in the backwoods, back channel somewhere and think, who cares? Somebody cares. The public cares, Indigenous communities care, and your fellow registrants care. So think about that. And one other comment on that is, it comes up from time to time, and it's just sort of a reflective thought. Is your ego getting in the way of the public interest? All right, so on to unlawful practice. It's all good news with me. Compliance with regulation. We used to call it infringement, but the PGA calls it unlawful practice. It's a little more punchy too. Growing program area, this is where your fees are going. I already talked about competent versus authorized, but that's very relevant here, and I want you to think more about that. We recognize as a top concern of registrants. We know that some of you are frustrated by an apparent inactivity on our part around this. But I also want to invoke the self-regulating aspect of us as a profession. You're part of our monitoring. We don't just magically know that somebody is infringing on a regulation. And correspondingly, most of these issues come from you to bring to our attention. But it doesn't end there. It's not just, oh, we dropped the package off on FPB's front door. There's an active role that you take in that self-regulation, having hard conversations with people, telling someone who's a non-registrant that they may be infringing on a regulated practice or a reserve practice. Practice hard conversations, because that's part of what we do, and our success is tied to how well we all do it, not just the staff. Okay, what else have I got here? Dean's going to start waving at me any minute. Historically, FPBC is not as a capacity to tackle this and range of extent of unlawful practice. Again, I'm making a commitment. We're going to be doing more, and we're going to be doing better, and you're going to see us publishing the results of this work. The prior presentation, as well as our annual report, talked about the number of concerns. In reality, that's a lot more than that. There's dozens and dozens of conversations about this. And then we have to decide which of those sort of meet a criteria for reporting. This significant employer audit revealed known systemic issues, and anybody in this room who's been practicing for a number of years knows there's systemic issues around unlawful practice and infringement. Key concerns in that area: historic registrants or retired or resigned registrants who are not entitled to practice but are dabbling, the soft retirement, right? No offense, it's just a risk that exists, and it's something we have to be actively monitoring for. Program managers, perception that leadership and decision-making is not the practice. Stop saying this. Just stop it, okay? It's not true. We don't, I was gonna say in here a couple of things. You don't stop practicing when you take your boots off. You don't stop practicing because you're managing people and issues. You don't stop managing because you're also a statutory decision maker. Sorry. Now, you can have other opinions on that, and we can have that discussion. But as a profession that's charged with the public interest and with trust in institutions on the chopping block, that's a global trend. We need to better assert our independence and discretion. The public expects and assumes that the mandates of the different organizations, be it the ministry, FPBC, are going to harmonize, that they're going to work together. And when we line them up to one another, they are aligned. But the interpretation of that is sometimes flawed. And if I'm getting people excited, good. Trainees in practicing roles without supervision. That's another one. Emerging employers' lack of awareness, so municipal governments. The practice is diversifying. We're not limited to the traditional sector. The skill set of a forest professional is highly applicable to different fields. And sometimes those fields don't even know it yet. And then once they discover them, they're like, we found out about foresters. And they start hiring them in droves, right? Now we're into this new area that's kind of new to us, and how do we regulate it, and all these discussions. And you can tell Garnet's good to go, right? And that's where we're heading. So, so how? You're probably asking how. Boy, you guys sound like you're ambitious. You're going to do all this stuff. Increase monitoring, info, escalating actions. And on the positive side, because there's sticks and there's carrots, right? And as a regulator, there's a few things we want to do. We want to regulate fairly, with empathy, kindness. I know it sounds weird. I can attest that everybody up here are nice people, and our staff want to help you. But at the same time, on the positive side, we want to create more options for registration. We want people to, if they don't fit into the traditional categories, we may have a category for you that will fit. And that's good for compliance. That's good for bringing people into the community practice. And increasing the number of certifications, transferability between jurisdictions, and diverse views, all in that regulated practice. So I hope that comes off as a generally good news, and thanks. And questions, I'll turn it back over. Thanks, everyone.
Dean's letting us have 2 questions. I'm going to look back at one that I'm seeing in here. 90%, the comment is, Christine, 90% of CPD compliance seems kind of low, especially when compared to last year. Are you not concerned a penalty could a penalty be applied? So when I say 90%, that's like everything was perfect. It's probably a lot higher than 90% because there was a ton of people who had 29.5 hours, 28 hours. So to Casey's point about realizing you are all people, we're regulating people, you're not widgets. We know that stuff happens. Sometimes people are sick. We want to talk to you and find out what happened. And if there's a reason you didn't quite get there, we're going to work with you and have some compassion for the reality that we all have lives, or that you missed a couple of hours. So the compliance is actually quite high. When you talk about the people who just don't want to move on with that number is like 40 people. So that's why I'm not concerned, because the vast majority of you are moving where we're supposed to be. For the 40 people or so who haven't embraced this responsibility, the bylaw is set out actually really clear, staged ways that we increase compliance with that requirement, which includes fees, which can include practice reviews, which can include eventually going to discipline and eventually escalating further. So there are very staged ways. I don't usually need to talk about that in this audience because, again, it's much higher than 90. It is quite high. And that's why, well, the official number in an annual report is 90, because on November 30th, that's exactly what happened. It's pretty high and it's pretty solid. So Dean, can I have one last one here? Wow, there's a lot of questions in here. It's very... I had one here, but you guys have been very busy and my thing has completely moved. Will the FPBC adopt an independent advocacy body similar to EGBC? So this isn't a question for the regulatory body. By our laws, FPBC can't establish that body. EGBC didn't establish that body. A separate entity was born. And what EGBC did, because they have 40,000 registrants, they moved some non-regulatory programs that equated to about $1 million of funding to a new entity so that they had funding to operate. We don't have those same circumstances. We don't have the ability to move that type of funding over for a new entity to start. So FPBC doesn't have plans to follow a model like that with EGBC. But what I can say is we can't advocate in members' interests. We don't have special interests. Our interest is the public. We are here as a regulatory body, as a profession, to protect the public's interest. And we can talk about that. That's those opinion columns. We can talk about the value proposition and the importance of our profession. We can talk about things like the tools forest professionals really need to do their job, the need you have for critical quality LiDAR data to make decisions with. Those are still appropriate things for the profession to talk about. What's not okay to talk about are very specific pet projects. We're not going to weigh in on how tenure should be allocated. We're not going to weigh in on very, very specific, more member or personal interest matters. But when you look at the forest sector, have your pick. There is a ton of associations operating in the forest sector that are advocacy bodies. There are, we have Kofi, we have other organizations, there's Woodlot Association, there's the Community Forest Association, there's a lot of different organizations that do have advocacy mandates. And so I don't know whether we need yet another one. There are a lot that are interest-based organizations to carry those messages, and I wonder if there's a fit there in terms of, can we have something separate and standalone? That would be something that would have to emerge in of itself as opposed to be guided or directed by the regulatory body.
Can I jump in?
Mm-hmm.
She's like, oh, I don't know. What I'd like to put in a plug here for, and I'm just going to direct everything after this to Garnet, is what my sense is when people say they want to advocate or they want us to advocate, it's because you're really passionate about your field that you're in. And you want it to succeed, you want it to have profile, you want it to improve, you want it to influence policy. We can do that as practitioners. And if you are within a group of practitioners with a similar scope of practice, reach out to one another, build a community of practice, and then call Garnet. But this is what we want to do. And channel that energy that you want the staff and the council or board to do within your peer groups. And we're going to help facilitate that. You're going to see that happen in the future. So I think that's a positive way to look at advocacy, and we're also advocating for what we do. We're growing the profession, and and there's a lot of pride in that. So.
All right, thank you, Christine, Aga, Casey, and Garnet. The next part of our program is an opportunity for FPBC and each of us to recognize forest professionals who we lost this past year. After I read their names, please join me in observing a minute of silence in their memory. Sorry. Robert Ahrens, RPF, retired, life member. Thomas Apsey, RPF, retired. Robert Braden, RPF. Robert Dawson, RFT. William Dumont, RPF, retired. Jerry Edwards, RFT. Alan Furness, RPF, retired. Frank Gunderson, RPF. Ian Hammond, RPF, retired. Bradley Layton, RFT. Jeffrey Lipset, RPF. James McMillan, RPF, retired. Christopher O'Connor, RPF, retired. Norman Perry, RPF. Jeffrey Sanvito, ATE. Darshan Sahota, RPF. Lyle Smith, RFT, retired. Robert Sutton, RPF, retired. Andres Zalke, RPF, retired, life member. Edward Vaughn, RPF, retired. William Young, RPF, retired. Please take a moment. Under the PGA, Council is required to appoint a returning officer and scrutineers for the 2024 board election. At the board's January meeting, the following registrants were appointed: Tony Wong, MRM, MBA, RPF, and returning officer, and Michael Armstrong, RPF, CPA, CA, scrutineer. Dave Patterson, RPF retired, scrutineer. Now it's time to also recognize and thank the members of the 76th board whose terms are ending. We have 2 this year who will be ending their term. First is David Gill, RPF. Dave is completing his 3rd year on the board as a council member or board member. Dave is also a resident here in Kelowna and working for the West Bank First Nation and its Natitik Development Corporation. During his time on the board, Dave provided us with calm, thoughtful, and measured deliberations and input on board business as we continued to navigate the changes brought on by the Professional Governance Act. I also want to acknowledge Wendy Royal, CPA, CA, who is not here today, but she served for 5 years with us as a government-appointed board member and provided important input and advice on how we transition to a more of a pure regulatory body. Last, and certainly not least, I want to thank Garnet Miro, RPF. He's our past board chair, and Garnet spent 5 years serving on the board, including time as both vice president and president. Garnet resigned earlier this year when he accepted his new position as FPBC's Director of Practice. So thank you, Garnet, and good luck in your new role. And thanks to all of those members who are, I extend a sincere thank you to each of them for all of their service and during these past 3 years. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Kelly Kitch, RFT, who will serve as your chair of the 77th FPBC board.
Thank you, Jamie. And thank you for your leadership on the board for this past year. I'm looking forward to introducing myself to you later this evening. And for those of you who don't know me who are watching online, my name is Kelly Kitch. I'm an RFT, and I work for the City of Mission on Mission Tree Farm License 26. For now, what I'm going to do is outline for you the makeup of the current board. Under the Professional Governance Act, our board includes 4 government-appointed lay members and 8 elected registrant members. A recent election was held to fill 1 vacancy for registrant member, and I'm pleased to announce that the successful candidate is Juliet Gavaya, RPF. Juliet will serve a 3-year term starting with this year's board. I'm also pleased to welcome back Carrie Simmons, RPF, as the new board vice chair. Carrie previously served for 3 years between 2017 and 2020. I want to thank all the candidates who put their names forward to stand for election on the board. Serving on the board is both a privilege and an incredible learning opportunity. And while you may not have been successful in the past, I hope you will consider putting your names forward again or joining one of our statutory committees. I highly recommend this as it is an opportunity to be involved in governance. And now I'd like to introduce the 77th FPBC board. Board members, please join me on the stage when I call your name. Vice Chair, Carrie Simmons, RPF. Immediate past Chair, Jamie Jeffries, RPF. Our registrant board members at large are Derek Burdikin, RPF. Dave Clark, RPF. Juliet Gavaya, RPF. Janice Mathers, RPF. And Sally Sellers, RPF. Our government-appointed board members are Allison Dempsey, PhD, and finally David Morell. We currently have 2 vacancies for government-appointed board members, and we expect those to be filled this spring. I want to thank you all for stepping up to volunteer on the board, and I look forward to working with you this coming year. And I'd like to just introduce again the 77th Board of FPBC. Back to you.
Thank you, Kelly. The board is in good hands under your leadership this year, and I look forward to my final year and under your leadership. Kelly will have another chance tonight at our recognition banquet to speak at greater length and give us some more thoughts on her approach for this year. Another change stemming from the PGA is the requirement that all board members and members of our statutory committees undertake an oath of office. To briefly explain the importance of the oath of office, please welcome back Casey McCauley, FPBC Registrar and Director of Act Compliance.
Thanks, Jamie. And we're definitely all human. I understand Jamie sponsoring Forrester was one of the deceased registrants, so you can imagine reading that list off. Under the Professional Governance Act, all board members and members of FPBC statutory committees are required to take an oath of office, which you can see on screen. The oath emphasizes the need for the board and committee members to act ethically, impartially, and with integrity. The oath is representative of how we, as members of a regulated profession, must always act in the public interest. It requires that the board and committee members put aside their personal interests when making decisions and not advocating for specific interests of our registrants or segments of registrants. The oath was administered to the 77th board at Wednesday's board meeting. And I just want to note that have a look at that as registrants, because I think it embodies the kind of independence that the public expects all of us to carry. Thank you.
Thanks, Casey. So this concludes the 76th FPBC AGM. We've had an excellent response to this year's conference program, has been said and recognized already by others. So thanks again to all of you who participated in the AGM and who are participating in the overall conference, both here and in person. We'll have a short coffee break now and then resume at 3 o'clock with our 2 breakout sessions for the afternoon. Details on those are in the conference app or on the conference platform online. So thanks again, enjoy the rest of today, and I look forward to seeing you tonight at the FPBC Recognition Banquet.